Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my regular update from what's going on in our Capitol. I got three items I want to hit before I get to your questions. First, we had the only public hearing that is being held by, I believe, any committee in Congress on the state of foreign interference in this year's election. And while we had good attendance from bipartisan members, and we had Meta, which is Facebook, we had Google, which is Alphabet, we had Microsoft. I'm in many ways, I'm kind of surprised that this did not garner more attention. Let's look at the facts. We know that foreign governments are trying to interfere in a massive way in our elections. We know that Russia is as active as ever. Matter of fact, just a few weeks ago, the Department of Justice announced an indictment of individuals that were actually Canadian in Tennessee who were funneling Russian funds knowingly or unknowingly to some right-wing commentators. We have seen companies like Meta take down RT, which was some of the vehicles that were being used in that area. We know as well that Iran hacked into the Trump campaign and tried to hack into other campaigns. And again, there, Google was a bit helpful on trying to help identify that. But the fact that, for example, we showed with charts, literally, sites that appeared to be Fox News or the Washington Post, where any observer would not have known that it was not a Fox News site or a Washington Post site. Had even bylines of a Washington Post reporter, for example. Everything exactly. This would be a artificial intelligence tool that's not a deep fake, not an image or a voice, but the real deal that got through any of the screening that is totally Russian propaganda. The fact that that's not making people's heads explode, the fact that, frankly, Fox News and Washington Post themselves don't seem that concerned, concerns me greatly. It also concerns me greatly that we should have left an empty chair yesterday, because the worst offender, the platform that has done the most to reduce any kind of content review, to make sure that users even follow their own rules of engagement, was Twitter, or X. They didn't even bother to participate. And as I mentioned, these same Fox News and Washington Post fake posts that were Russian propaganda appear dramatically more on a platform like X. We're trying to get from all of the companies the number of Americans who've seen that false information. We also are seeing the fact that there are still Russian agents buying ads on many of these social media platforms, and we need to do a better job. We need the public to be more concerned. I mean, the truth is, Americans got a First Amendment right. They can say crazy things and be protected. Unfortunately, sometimes when political candidates say crazy things and get amplified, that is a problem, but that's a First Amendment right. What is not is to then have a foreign government's spy services take that information and amplify it, or create very similar stories that are 100% false. And we see the Russians, we see the Iranians, we've seen the Chinese actually not focus as much on presidential campaigns, but on lower ballot, down ballot issues. We're starting to see some of these other nation states focus as well, because we know, if Vladimir Putin can do anything to undermine American support for Ukraine, he will. And doing that through misinformation and interfering in our elections is a heck of a lot cheaper than buying more tanks and guns. The other thing that we need to be aware of is this activity level. We're not even into the real season. We all know in Virginia we start early vote tomorrow. But as we've seen in other nation states, and there was examples of what happened, for example, in Slovakia with AI tools, this will get much worse the closer we get to the election. And what I've called for from all of these tech firms is, what is their surge capability going to be in those 48, 72 hours before the election, where people will be probably smearing all kinds of misinformation out there. And honestly, because we all expect this to be a very close presidential election, what are their plans, the social media companies, to make sure that the foreign governments are not interfering in the immediate aftermath? In many ways, the most dangerous time for the integrity of our election this cycle, particularly when you've got certain candidates saying they may not accept the results of the election, will be in that 24, 48, 72 hours after the election, where candidly in some states, we in Virginia count pretty darn quick, but in some states just the counting process, if the vote is close, could take some days. Awful lot of opportunities for mischief. We all need to be, I think, on much higher alert. I think we all kind of got, in the aftermath of 2016, this issue got elevated, and unfortunately now with people willing to believe virtually anything on the internet, with the adversaries getting better, with more countries coming in and trying to weigh in, this is a very dangerous time. As I said yesterday to my colleagues and to the companies, we got enough differences between Americans, and we ought to argue with those full force without having foreign spy services try to interfere in our elections. And my strong belief is they are doing that. They will do more, and we have to be prepared over these next 47 days. Point one. Second point, happy to release today, Senator Kaine and I, $4.5 million on a veterans suicide prevention program. This was a law that I wrote back in 2020. We still have way too many veterans committing suicide. The numbers a year or so back, I think they've come down a little bit, but they were amazing and outrageous. I know Secretary McDonough was down at Hampton, I believe, yesterday. I've not got a full readout, but I do believe he was going to talk about suicide prevention. This is a case of where we need more resources, but we also need to just have better coordination. I mean, literally I've seen numbers that say close to half of the veterans who commit suicide have never made themselves available to the kind of services they have earned as a veteran. So I know, for example, in Hampton Roads, we had a pretty good initiative a couple years ago so that, a veteran comes in homeless, a veteran comes in high, a veteran comes in a circumstance where they may want to do self-harm. Can we have somebody in local law enforcement that can refer them quickly over to the veteran services that are available? All of that's going to be made a bit easier by the law I passed in 2020. Rachel, you're going to give me the name. It was named after a sergeant.
Sergeant Parker Gordon Fox.
It was named after Staff Sergeant Gordon Parker Fox. He was not a Virginian, but there was a horrific story about him. We passed that bill. I wrote that bill. $4.5 million coming into Virginia. This is a problem. I don't care where you fall on the political aisle. I don't care what kind of, whether you're even involved in politics. This is something we all ought to be concerned about, and there is more to be done. Final topic, which is a rerun of last week's news on this item, or the same rerun. You can almost punch in my exact comments for threats of government shutdowns every time we've done it the last 6 or 7 times. No state gets hurt worse than Virginia. We have our military, we have our government contractors, we have our federal employees. You want to take a trip in terms of what it could do to air traffic control. We've got great parks. Stupidity on steroids is the line I always use, and it's bearing out again. The country would get the country would catch a cold, we'd get the flu, or whatever analogy like that, because Virginia is so dependent upon these federal resources. It would be crazy for us to go about this shutdown. All legitimate forces, Democrat and Republican alike, says it makes no sense to do a government shutdown with people already voting in Virginia. It will come up literally in the next weekend. We went through a kabuki theater in the House where the Speaker knew his plan was going to fail. I don't understand the House. I'm not I don't get it virtually anyway. Why this kind of kabuki theater needs to go on. They're back at ground zero. We got to get our job done. The most efficient, smartest, and virtually every rational member in both parties would agree, let's do a 3-month clean continuing resolution. Yes, it's kicking the can, but it's kicking the can with the least disruption. I'm sure we will, the countdown clocks on the news channels will start middle of next week. I'm still pretty optimistic that it'll get done, but boy, oh boy, oh boy. Why do we have to put folks through this? Remember, there's a whole series of government agencies that by law within 2 weeks of a proposed shutdown, because that's when the money runs out at the end of September, end of the fiscal year, have to go through all these procedures. So we are wasting taxpayer money right now because what should have happened at the beginning of the month is let's pass that short-term continuing resolution and then get back to agreeing or disagreeing about a host of issues that we have that that should be the focus of some of the great divisions we have in our country, not going through this kind of process. Extra long, I'm sorry on that. I'm happy to now go. Laura, let's take some of the questions. Hello, are you guys
I wanted
there?
to follow up on.
Hello, Laura. Can you
hear me now?
Laura, can you make sure we're identifying who's asking and or who's running the show?
Senator, this is Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. I hope you can hear me okay. Wanted to follow up on the election interference. You made very clear how concerned you are about it. What more do you think needs to be done going forward as we get into this more intensified period of the campaign? As you said, it probably is only going to get worse in the weeks ahead.
It would be great if some of the biggest players like X, Twitter, would actually be helpful and engaged. It would be great if we had more engagement with TikTok, which again was brought up not by me but by my Republican partners, ultimately controlled by the Communist Party of China, and we now have literally tens of millions of young Americans who get almost all their news from TikTok. It would be important if mainstream media continued to emphasize just because you read it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And this is where we need the social media companies as well, because if you or I, Mitchell, I'm fairly tech savvy, but if I looked at this Fox News posting or Washington Post posting, unless you checked the URL at the very top, you would have no idea it was fake. I want to know from the companies, how did that get through? How many Americans saw those posts? How many of them are there? So that we get a scale out there. And again, it's one of the wild things is there are so many claims and counterclaims in this presidential election. I mean, would anybody have thought that a presidential election issue would be whether immigrants were eating pets in a certain Ohio city? So it doesn't take much because people are willing to kind of accept there's so much craziness going on, but the adversaries, if they would have made some of these stories up 6 or 8 years ago, people would of course reject them. That's crazy. But there's so much craziness that the adversary fake Fox News page or fake Washington Post news story just takes the craziness and shades it 20% more. I don't know how, we got to make our public better informed, but boy, oh boy, we need the social media platforms to do a better job of policing. I'm going to be meeting with the government entities involved. They have to do a better job of getting this word out. We need to act quickly, as the Justice Department did against the Russian efforts and now information against the Iranians. I'm amazed that these big media companies like Fox and Washington Post aren't actually trying to say, hold on here, this is not us. I almost feel like people are kind of saying it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. We got enough differences between ourselves that we are legitimate issues for fighting. Even if somebody American says something crazy, they've got a right to say that. What we don't have a right to, is not appropriate or legal or international security, is to allow foreign spy services to come in and create totally false content or amplify untrue content for the benefit of those foreign governments, of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Anybody that says their spy services ought to be driving our election process, I'd like to hear that, but unfortunately, unless we raise our game, that could have a dramatic effect. And what I am terrified about is that this builds and builds and builds in that last 48 hours before the election and the 48 hours after the election, while the votes are being counted. They come in and stoke division that, again, could be unprecedented.
Senator, our next question is Jernara Bussey with 13 News Now.
Hello, Senator. Thank you for taking us today. I wanted to ask, obviously you've been very big on the Veterans Affairs Center or Medical Center in Hampton and their need for improvement over the years, from wait times to care. And we know a few months ago, the director and chief of staff were removed. Today, the Secretary of Veteran Affairs visited the Hampton Medical Center. Do you have hope that more improvements will come after a visit like that?
Yeah. I think we got to keep the pressure on. I think the vast majority of the workforce at Hampton does a very good job. They care about our veterans. It is, and this is a certain way where money is part of the issue, but it's not always money. It's the fact that we had a really antiquated, this is a few years back, telephone system. We had a really antiquated scheduling system. As recently as 5 years ago, we were operating on 1990s technology. That's crazy. And what I hear from veterans is, if they can get into the VA at Hampton, they feel like they get good service. But the problem of getting in has been a real hassle. It's gotten better. We've changed out some of those systems. We've allowed veterans that if they've got too far to drive, they can access the private healthcare system. We provided other options. One of the ongoing systemic problems at Hampton, and this is not just Hampton, but it's where I see this the most. We see it similarly in Richmond and Salem, and we are expanding capacity. In the South Side on Chesapeake, we will soon have a massive new facility open. Up in Fredericksburg, we're building new capacity. That will take off a lot of the burden. But one of the ongoing problems, I almost feel like I'm talking about now the post office issues as well, is about pay, because, to get the specialty care, to get the podiatrist, to get the dermatologist, to get the right kind of physical therapist, at the end of the day, the VA oftentimes doesn't pay the market rates that Riverside or Sentara might pay. So I got to keep the pressure, that not only to keep money going into the system, but to see if we can give the VA more flexibility to not only hire but then retain those providers. And the problem, I can give you chapter and verse, of certain specialty cares, and I think podiatry and dermatology are the couple of them, where we get fully staffed, and then a couple docs quit, and then that suddenly makes the wait time longer to get the appointment. So, I appreciate the fact that I think we got to keep the pressure on. One of the things that I think when I show up, they know I'm going to ask about all these wait times. They know I'm going to ask about patient satisfaction. If that helps keep people on their toes and they can up their game a bit, all the better. And again, the Hampton Roads area, we've got the largest growth in veterans population of any market in the country. And it's one of the reasons why this much larger facility on the south side, which is, I should add this in the back of my head, is scheduled to be open, I think, next year, will take off some of the pressure on the larger, older facility at Hampton itself.
Senator, our next question is Avery Davis with 29 News.
Hello, Senator. I think Mitchell asked my exact same question, and you covered everything. Thank you.
We're going to move on to Atra El-Nashar with Sinclair.
Hey, Senator, thanks so much for talking about the election interference. That's what I'm covering today. And I'm hoping, you're obviously so privy to the methods that Iran, Russia, and China use to interfere in our elections and cause division. And I'm glad you talked about, too, people being aware of where they're getting their media and if it's credible. Are there any other methods or strategies or tips you want people to know about so that they can avoid letting these foreign tactics win? What should people be aware of? And I was also,
Great.
struck by the fact that you said it'll get worse the closer we get, 24, 72 hours out from the election. What can people do on their own?
Well, great question. One, let me tell you, one of my concerns early on in the system, early on this year, and I'm hesitant to say we're in the clear because my words will probably come back and bite me. When we think about foreign interference, we think about attacking the integrity of the voting system, the machines themselves. CISA has done a pretty good job of upping that technology protections from cyber attacks. We can never be perfect, but because we have a distributed system, because we've gone to paper ballot backups, we are in better shape. On the misinformation, disinformation, as I said before, the reasons why I am concerned this year, we got AI tools, we've got other nations other than Russia realize this is cheap and effective. We went for about 6 months because of a law case where there was no communication between the social media platforms and the government on foreign interference. And, from candidates from all level of offices to just general Americans' lack of trust in our institution, oftentimes people may believe wacky stuff on the internet more than they believe any of you who are on this line. I don't know. I don't have a magic bullet solution to that fix. So what I want, and the social media companies, 27 of them, back in March agreed, particularly around artificial intelligence, that they would put new rules in place. We didn't, unfortunately, Congress failed here. We didn't put any AI rules in place, although I would point out a number of states, and they range from Texas to Alabama to California to Florida, even actually, frankly, the states that are viewed more Republican-wise, said they would prohibit in their electioneering that you can't use deep fakes. You can't have my face or my voice appear if it's not me. And there was a promise the companies would make about what's called watermarking, so you can authenticate content. All these companies, the 27 big companies that signed up in March to say they would do this, my question to them yesterday was, well, you got these things that look like Fox News and Washington Post. Why isn't there a watermark on that? They have not met the voluntary goals they set up. And it's why I think ultimately we're going to need some national legislation. We've got some state laws. We don't have it in Virginia. What can we do? Well, I want to make sure that we are what's called tipping and queuing. So if our intelligence community sees this activity coming, let's say out of Russia, which is the worst offender, and some of you may remember there was a group called the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg that did a lot of this in 2016. That was run by a guy named Prigozhin, who was the guy who got killed and trying to do the coup against Putin. That same group has simply reconstituted itself under a different name. So if we see activity coming out of there, how do we make sure that activity is notified to local law enforcement and to the social media companies? That's my job, is to stay on the government to do its job. My job as well, and what we were trying to do yesterday, and again, why it's so irresponsible of X to basically punt on their responsibility, is to try to encourage, jawbone, harangue the social media companies to do a better job. How did these fake Fox News and Washington Post sites get through Facebook's very own checking control? And all of these companies, they say otherwise, but all of these companies have been pretty well documented, have cut back on their own internal control mechanisms. And then you had a company like X that's basically eliminated any of their control mechanisms. So short of legislation, a little bit of this is name and shame. I'm not sure I can shame the ownership of X, but we ought to be raising our voices. And then the last point, which is one that I'm, if we were having this conversation in June, I'd say I'm still concerned about the integrity of the voting system, concerned about misinformation, disinformation. I feel much better about the voting system. I feel like the communication between the government and the social media companies has gotten better. I'm glad DOJ has identified the Russian group in Tennessee and the Iranian group that was just announced yesterday. But boy, oh boy, I am horribly worried that the last couple days, the last few hours before the election, and something that, it appears now that this is going to be a very close election at the presidential level, those hours after the polls close, when the votes are being counted, you talk about a perfect time for mischief. You talk about the ability for a foreign spy agency to put up a video that looks like it's an election official destroying ballots or doing something crazy, particularly when you have candidates who say may or may not abide by the votes of the people, and you have a tinderbox that could create violence in this nation. And we all, no matter who we support at any office for elected office in America, as we've seen with the attempted assassination attempts against former President Trump, there is no place in America for political violence. And the possibility, I think, of incitement towards that kind of violence right up to the election and right after the election, perpetrated by foreign spy services, we have to be on guard for.
Senator, our next question is Rachel Branning with WSET.
Hi, Senator. Question for you is, since the decision won't be reached on a TikTok ban until after the November election, are you particularly concerned that foreign agencies could exploit that site's vulnerabilities for election interference?
As I've said, let me step back. As I've said, there's a lot of creativity on TikTok. I love the fact that people make their living as social influencers there. And many of the critiques that are made about TikTok, I can make about Facebook. I can make about YouTube. I sure as heck can make about X. And even some of the secondary sites like Discord and Telegram that are the wild, wild west. The difference with TikTok and why 80% of the Congress, Democrat and Republican alike, House and Senate alike, said this one's different because at the end of the day, Chinese law, ByteDance, which owns TikTok, is a Chinese company. Chinese law says that company has to answer to the Communist Party of China. And there's lots of data out there about, you try to go on TikTok and find, any postings about Tibet or any postings about democracy in Hong Kong. You can't find it. You can find plenty on Instagram. You can find plenty on other platforms. And the idea that the Communist Party of China could, at the end of the day, twist those algorithms so that suddenly the news they're seeing, it doesn't even have to be fake news, but what they emphasize would be stories that say, America's a bad place, American democracy stinks, Putin ought to win in Ukraine, Taiwan is not worth America's interest. Those may even be, legitimate points of view. I don't agree with them, but they may be points of view offered even by Americans. But if suddenly the algorithm says that's all you see on TikTok, we ought to be concerned. So am I concerned? Absolutely. We'll see what the courts have to say, but you're 100% right. None of this is going to be changed by law prior to the election.
Senator, our next question is Tad Diggins with the Cardinal News.
Thanks for your time, Senator. You spoke about the 48 hours after, and I heard you give one example of a possibility, a video from Russia or something like that. What are some other possibilities? Have you all been sort of wargaming any of this stuff and have an idea of anything that you could do to sort of ameliorate what effects this might have?
Let me take a couple. Many Virginians might know my face. They, of course, will know Kamala Harris's face. They'll know Donald Trump's face. Nobody knows who the face of your local election official is. So a video pops up, on certain platforms, and it's reported to be local election official in city X or county Y, and it looks like they are destroying ballots or leading up to the election. It looks like somebody is secretly breaking into one of the drop boxes. It doesn't take much imagination to think about what could happen. What the fact afterwards is, on you don't need a video. I go back to my Fox News site or Washington Post site. Washington Post site announces, Kamala Harris wins North Carolina by 10 points. Not being the truth. Then it comes back out, but people point to the Washington Post. The same flip side will be, Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania by 1 million votes. Not true, but they read it on something that appears to be Fox News. One of the reasons why the mainstream media need to be a little more leaning in as well, they have a responsibility as well to help call out that this is not their site. But that period, and in 2016 and 2020, we were mostly focused on what happens up to election. The vast majority of us, never expected the aftermath in 2020. We never expected January 6th. We never expected an unwillingness or an attempt to undermine the legitimate vote of Americans about which votes would be certified. I would hope and pray, and I'm proud of the fact that I was one of the authors of what's called the Electoral Count Act that could make sure that you can't have states misrepresent. We've done as good a job as we can, but we live in a world where, when you got candidates that say they're not going to accept the will of the vote of the people, and that, especially if it's a tight vote, you got foreign governments saying we want to stir dissension. That is a broth that could boil over very quickly. And what I see with particularly when we've seen almost a edge of political violence creeping more and more into our campaign, when we see election workers, give you another example that I think is, I would be terrified. I mean, let's say, you're in a jurisdiction that's going to be very tight, and suddenly, 48 hours before the election, it appears that there is a group, let's say one of the, a right-wing group that's not really a right-wing group that says, we're going after all of the poll workers in Community X. You put that kind of word out, and I don't know about in your community, most of the poll workers in Alexandria, in my city, are senior citizens who've done this for years. They do it out of respect for democracy and community. But if you had some kind of shot across the bow, 24, 48 hours, targeting poll workers in key jurisdictions, how many of them might decide, well, maybe I'm not going to turn up today? And you could have groups being represented that that aren't that group. So I don't want to overly scare people, but the fact that this is the fact that our hearing wasn't front page news or leading each of your TV and radio broadcasts mean I've got more work to do, but I hope we all would take on this responsibility. But as journalists, I think it's partially your responsibility as well. We got plenty of divisions. Let's have Americans, argue it out and debate it out. But we should all be united in the fact that we shouldn't have foreign governments, foreign spy services inciting violence or splitting us apart.
Senator, our final question is Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. I wanted to lean in on your Danville visit last week, specifically when it comes to converting older spaces into apartment-style housing. Now, here in the South Side, it's possible to live in a former tobacco warehouse, former school buildings, soon a former mill, and more. And now that you've toured one in progress, what intrigues you about these types of spaces, and what kind of impact do you see these conversions having on the Virginia housing market?
I love all of our communities in Virginia. But I got to tell you, I think Danville has earned the reputation as comeback city. The old white plant there, that giant building. I can remember for years driving through with Danville community leaders saying needs to be torn down. It's a eyesore. Thank God it wasn't torn down. Those apartments, those roughly 200 apartments. I say this to my friends in Richmond and Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, Charlottesville, you name it. These are potentially some of the coolest sites with some of the greatest views, with high ceilings, at a rate 1/4. I know we're moving back to in-person work, but the ability, if you could do remote work, check out Danville. And, this isn't like a one-off. I've been to a whole bunch of warehouses in Danville. I see some of the same in Lynchburg. We've clearly got some of this going on in Richmond. We have to do, this kind of creativity is great. Here's one idea. We got to up housing supply. Not every community has a great old warehouse tobacco building. What every community does have, virtually every community, they've got an old strip mall or an old covered mall, or in some cases just a line of half dozen stores that's been out of business, closed, or failing businesses now for years. I'm not sure how many of those are ever going to come back. We ought to put a tax incentive in place that says, how can we reconstruct these strip malls to be both mixed use, maybe refurbished retail on a ground floor, put a second floor there in terms of housing, whether it's condo or rental housing. Remember, you've already got water and sewer, you already got broadband, you got plenty of parking. Maybe you can even take back some of that parking. But as we think about the tax debate, I'm going to have a strip mall revitalization plan in place, because there's not a community that doesn't have available land in close with water, sewer, and parking and roads, but it's going to take a little more creativity than some of the old programs. In many ways, the big tobacco or furniture or other facilities, they may be easier than the classic strip mall, but never underestimate American ingenuity. And, if we can make sure that it becomes potentially a profitable project, boy, oh boy, we can help to fill into our older cities and to our older suburbs. One of the things, again, want to give a quick shout out for Henrico County. They have done something extraordinarily cool where they've taken a challenging issue, how you place data centers and where you place them. I got a lot of views on that, but what Henrico did was the data center revenue generates close to $60 million a year. It is all going into creative housing projects, both rental and home ownership projects in Henrico. There's a lot to be learned from that kind of model as we in Virginia grapple with both the pros and the cons of these data centers.
Senator, that was our final question.
You got me off of my head exploding on elections. Amy always gives me an upbeat question at the end, but thanks you all. Hang in. I guess it's one thing I'd also quickly say is the fact that I didn't get a single follow-up question on the CRs and shutdown of government means we're probably all, tired of seeing the same TV show over and over and over again. Be safe, everyone.